Hello, how's everyone doing? Welcome to the Creative Spark. My name is Conrad Benner and I am your co-host. I run a blog called Streets Department here in Philadelphia. It's been going for 11 years and I love to talk about art in the public space. I'm also a podcaster and a curator, and I'm excited to join you.
Well, I'm your other co-host, Ginger Rudolph. Let's see. I've been running Haha Magazine for about 10 years. We are in archival mode right now. So if you check that out, it's just the past things we have done. And I've started full forward being a public arts curator and historian here in Philadelphia. So Creative Spark is the evolution of a series I had hosted before. I'm sure you guys were used to the art of activism, but we're going to host conversations with different people going forward.
Yeah, and thank you, Ginger, and for Mural Arts Philadelphia for inviting me to be a part of this rebrand, this relaunch. We have some really exciting conversations planned coming up over the next several months, starting with tonight.
Yeah, so it's going to be a monthly talk show where Conrad and I, my art partner, are going to sit down with change makers here and talk about infrastructure and the entertainment of our lives.
Yeah, each month we'll focus on a different relevant topic and dive in with one local and one national guest. Together, we'll explore the practices and intentions of creative thinkers from around the country.
So you're all here tonight because this is our first episode. So thank you for joining us. And we're going to host a conversation about our connection to transformative public space.
Yeah, in this episode, we're joined from leaders from nonprofits in Philly and Atlanta. And both are working to transform former industrial era infrastructure into useful and creative public space for the communities that surround them.
So please join us in welcoming our guest tonight. We have Rebecca Cordes-Chan, which is the executive director of the Rail Park in Philadelphia, and Miranda Kyle, who's the program manager of arts and culture for the Atlanta Beltline. Welcome, guys.
Yes. And, Ginger and I love offering folks the opportunity to introduce themselves and get behind those titles. So maybe we could start with Rebecca and then go to Miranda. Could you tell us a bit more about your organization and your job title? What's your day-to-day?
Sure. First of all, thank you both for inviting me and also just thinking of the Rail Park for the first Creative Spark conversation. I'm Rebecca Cordes-Chan. I'm the executive director of Friends of the Rail Park. We are the 501c3 nonprofit organization that stewards and also advocates for the future phases of the Rail Park. Or I should have said stewards phase 1 of the Rail Park and advocates for the future phases of the park. For those of you who are not super familiar with the Rail Park, it is a vision for a 3.1 mile linear park and pathway that is reusing historical Pennsylvania and Reading railroad lines. It bisects basically Center City, Philadelphia, starting around the Art Museum and on its eastern terminus, ending in kind of the Northern Liberties neighborhood. Because you asked about our organization and just kind of the day-to-day of running a small nonprofit, we are a staff of 2 currently, and we will be actively recruiting and kind of, building our staff capacity as well. But what I really like about this job is that in addition to kind of being in kind of the startup mode where we really get to build systems and think about how to build out an organization, it's also really seasonal. So right now we're very much in planning mode. We're kind of gearing up for spring and summer programming. And then we kind of shift into these more seasonal aspects where we're out doing cleanups, where we're out kind of planning for public programs and executing on those. And also thinking about, again, kind of designing and advocating for the future faces of the park as well. So it's a little bit of a mix of urban planning, of economic development, of arts and culture. And I just really appreciate that I get to wake up and do that every day.
And Miranda, yeah.
God, hello everyone. I'm Miranda Kyle. I'm the Arts and Culture Program Manager for Atlanta Beltline Inc. and I curate the annual public art exhibition Art on the Atlanta Beltline, which is located on the ancestral homelands of both the Cherokee and the Muskogee peoples. And so the Beltline is a monster of a project. Much like the Rail Park, it is a Rails to Trail project. It is part of what is known as the Highline Network. The Highline being sort of the most famous or well-known of these Rails to Trails projects that happen all over the country, which are reclamations involving infrastructure that reclaim old rail lines and turn them into systems of parks, trails, sometimes transit, very often public art. And so Atlanta Beltline Inc., the organization I work for, is kind of a weird organizational structure. We are quasi-governmental. We were created to be more nimble than the City of Atlanta's Parks Department, but we also have a sister organization, which is a 501c3, which helps us with philanthropic fundraising and that sort of thing. Art on the Atlanta Beltline, the public art program component, is tasked with curating and activating the 22-mile loop that encircles the interior of Atlanta. We move through 45 neighborhoods. Right now, 13 miles have been constructed since 2009. Art on the Atlanta Beltline, the public art program, is the oldest ongoing project that lives inside this massive infrastructure effort. And that is because public art was seen as a way to get people out onto the corridor that was infested by kudzu. And so if you're not from the South, you may have not heard of kudzu, but it is the vine that has eaten the South. And it's basically like this beautiful, glorious blanket of green that nothing on this planet will kill. And so it is the bane of landscape architects everywhere down here. So this old abandoned rail corridor that encircled the city was covered in kudzu and had like all kinds of infamous legends around it, and grew out of a dream of a grad student named Ryan Gravel in 1999, and the idea of an emerald necklace, which was a civil engineering idea that came out of a mayoral administration in the 70s, and it manifested as this beautiful project. And the art was seen as a way to get people out onto the corridor and invested in this project and exploring. Because if you could go out and see public art, and then you look down this trail and see more public art, suddenly you've walked a mile, you've walked 2 miles, and now you're a part of this dream and you want to see it keep going. So here we are, 12 years later, doing really cool public art projects around 13 miles. And my job is to work with departments of infrastructure and real estate and landscape architecture and everybody else involved in building this out to make sure art and cultural activities are invested at every step of the way. And we design laterally with community. We also bring in outside big name artists to work with local rock stars, and we're meeting public art needs at every level. And so that's a little bit of the umbrella of the project. It's 12 years, so there's a lot we can cover, but that's the Reader's Digest version.
And you gave us a great insight into what I think a couple of different avenues we can walk down with tonight's conversation, including the use of art and working with local artists to create these spaces. I'll say now too, just as a top of the line thing, I can't think of the word right now. If you have questions along the line, please put them in the comments section, put them in the Q&A chat. We will have about 10 minutes at the end of this chat if you'd like to turn your camera on and ask questions to our guests face to face. But if you also have questions just as we're going along and you think it might be relevant to the conversation more immediately, type it in the chat, type it in the Q&A section. Our eyes are over there as well. You know, Miranda and Rebecca, it's something that Ginger and I have noticed and talked about in preparing for this interview is, you know, we're 2 years into COVID, and it seems like our parks and our public spaces have become this really crucial, critical resource for communities when maybe it was a little bit safer to be outdoors than indoors. And you'd think that would make local governments and maybe folks in these cities who have money throw themselves at folks like you to make sure that the development projects that you're doing, these public space initiatives that you're creating, happen more quickly, have the kind of proper funding that you're hoping to have. And so I'm wondering if in this COVID era, because I know you're both sort of in the middle of your projects in different ways, or I guess Rebecca, Rail Park's really at the beginning. Where are you now in the scope of your project, and have the revelations of how important public space are that have happened in the last few years help to open any of the barriers that are currently there in producing your projects? And let's start with Rebecca.
Sure. Where to start with that one? There's a lot in that question. So I would start by saying that Friends of the Rail Park has actually commissioned a cost estimate and feasibility study looking at the full kind of 3 mile vision for the rail park. This was kind of prompted not only by the fact that we have new leadership, both at the kind of staff, but also board level. But also, as you had mentioned, I think COVID has shifted a lot of priorities for the many stakeholders that not only own rail park proper, or kind of vision for rail park property, but the kind of property owners adjacent to the vision as well, and the park as well. And so the purpose of this study is to kind of identify where does it make sense to go next with the second phase of the park. A lot of people like to point to the section known as the viaduct, or others, think about like the tunnel or other sections of the park. But until we do this kind of analysis, and one that also includes, a timeline and how much it's going to cost, there's really no path forward. I'm really excited to say that we've had really great response from the stakeholders that we have engaged in this study, and I think that's going to really help accelerate the park's development. I also think with the investment that we're seeing happening at the federal level, as well as state and locally, we do have this kind of, I guess, a silver lining of the pandemic is that there's an investment in infrastructure, in public space that we're hoping to kind of tap into with the rail park as well. So I will stop there. The results of that study are due back in about a month, and so we're hoping to kind of move forward with that planning and kind of announce the focus of our work going forward after the fact. But I'll also just say, and I'm sure Miranda, you can empathize here, that these projects take a very long time. There are so many stakeholders and complicated hoops to jump through, and that's before you even get to kind of the capital costs associated with developing a project at this scale. So I'll pause there and let Miranda have a turn.
Ooh, yes, community engagement becomes our middle name. And a really unique, I think, and beautiful sort of facet of the Atlanta Beltline is a portion of the funding is created through a tax allocation district that is within a certain overlay around the corridor. So a portion of tax monies for capital projects or private development around the corridor goes to help fund the ongoing construction, which is very helpful because we're supposed to be done by 2030, which is essentially tomorrow. And so we're, the intention is to deliver a fully realized trail, transit as well, like light rail transit around the corridor, as well as parks and public art by 2030. That's a lot of work. I hope it all happens by 2030, but more than likely we'll be able to have this lovely conversation in, another 15 years and, we'll still be talking about public art and transit in Atlanta. But because of that as one component, it's enabled us to do a lot of work much more nimbly than in a typical philanthropically funded only process that we see with some of these rails to trails conversion projects. While we do still heavily engage the philanthropic community, and we're also eligible for certain governmental grants because we are quasi-governmental, having a multi-tiered approach to funding does help us push the project along at a relatively good clip considering bureaucracy and paperwork and all of that. So we're not quite yet in sunset phase. And when it comes to public art, we have temporary and permanent installations along the corridor. I work very closely with my counterparts at the city of Atlanta because once we hit that 2030 mark, all my work gets converted to city. So it all becomes part of the city's permanent collection. The programs go under the city's purview. So I work hand in hand with them to make sure that that sort of transition, when it does happen, will be seamless.
That's interesting. And I guess from a standpoint of the people listening right now, I'm going to throw two things at you that I know are really loaded. Like when we're doing the analysis of the park, Rebecca, like where does public opinion sit with that? And then also what Miranda was saying, like I understand this huge complexity of the park, or I think I understand from what you're saying, but I also kind of want to talk about some of the bureaucratic hurdles that are involved in both of these processes, because I think when we're thinking about the parks, we all just want it now, don't we? And we don't get to see, right? It's like we want it now. Like I want to.
Actually, I want it yesterday. Can it be done yesterday? Yeah. No. Well,
me too.
But I think if people could actually understand some of what you're tackling, that maybe we could be a bit more patient about what's going on in that transitional period.
Well, I think, speaking to the study, I think part of the study, we actually haven't done a lot of kind of public facing engagement around the study, because part of the purpose of the study is to almost like cross out the things that are not options. I don't want to just like take this out to the public and be like dream, big and like the sky's the limit, when it's like, well, we actually, can't do a community garden in this particular space because the soil is super, super toxic and you don't want to eat anything that's coming out of there. So I think that's part of the study at this phase, at least, and realizing, there's lots more planning to do, but it's kind of narrowing down the options so we can be very realistic about what is possible, how much it's going to cost, what that decision-making process looks like, in as transparent as possible way, before we just kind of like throw things at the wall and see what sticks, if that makes sense.
Let's dig even a little bit more. Like, what is a study? Like, I'm not sure what that is. Is that talking with experts, talking with community? What is that?
Yeah, so it's a design team that has landscape architects, urban planners, architects, geospatial analysts, an engineer. An engineer is very important. That have actually gone out. They've looked at the site. They're really analyzing the physical fabric and looking at what's possible there, and then attaching numbers to what it actually would mean to convert that to safe, accessible, usable space. And then on top of that as well, also looking at specifically who owns what property, their willingness to, because again, like we're not just talking about the physical space we want to put a park, it's also about accessing the park as well. So, who is actually on board with seeing this happen, who is, not responding to our request to participate in the study, et cetera, to understand, where is there an opportunity, and where can we be really focusing our efforts, because 3 miles it's just too much. It's too big of a lift at this point. And I think also, thinking about on the back end of that too, beginning to think about how the park might, kind of look and function as well. So, and part of that's driven, of course, by funding. So for example, if we were to tap DOT funding, it needs to, bike lanes become more of a focus of our efforts. If we, it just kind of, without getting too in the weeds about all of that, but that can also begin to determine form and function and what the options are there too.
I think too, because if you're a giant infrastructure project and you're also doing public art programming, it can be very frustrating for artists, because they're like, hey, I have a dream for this place or this space, or I see like how amazing something could be here. And then because artists are dreamers and they have to be a part of all of these infrastructure projects from the beginning, but even just coming on for temporary projects, it can be kind of heartbreaking when they're like, I have a dream and I have a vision for this place. And you're like, actually, no, this is a brownfield. We can't really do that here because you'll get some weird arsenic poisoning. Like, and that happens a lot because you're a rail system. Everything that was next to a rail system, 50 or 100 years ago was horrible for the environment. So there's all kinds of like these push and pull restrictions of like, okay, well, you can dig those footers, but they can't be more than 12 inches in the ground, or they can't be more than 24 inches in the ground. And sorry, you can't have, an edible, walkable garden, even though that sounds magical, because we can't poison small children who walk through this area. It's a lot of stuff like that. That is this translation, right? I think people in the position that Rebecca and I are in is acting as a translator between these like almost like overly inaccessible bureaucratic infrastructure processes that a lot of people are like, I really don't care about that. And people at the community level who are like, this is in my backyard, this is moving through my neighborhood, this is part of my public space. How do I have authorship in what's happening here? And I think that is a very sacred role, honestly, and it comes with a lot of gravity, is standing in this like translator position between the bureaucracy and leadership of the infrastructure, right? Who may not understand those dreamers who live in our communities, who need to have those dreams lifted up and realized in a way that's safe and reflective of the communities we're moving through.
Yeah. Oh, there's so much I want to dig into with you, Miranda, on that. I just want to take this moment though to offer just like a hats off to actually Rail Arts and my predecessors at the Rail Park and a number of other partners. for the 2019 Sight Sound Festival, in which an undeveloped section of the rail park was actually activated for, I believe it was a few different weekends. But what I loved about that project, and I, of course, have only seen photos, but everyone loves to tell me how awesome it was. But even just, kind of seeing the photos and knowing how much it was appreciated is that by working with artists, I should start with that, to activate an undeveloped part of the rail park. I think it did exactly this dreaming, this kind of inviting community into a space, even for just a couple nights, in such an inclusive and imaginative way that showing someone like a rendering just can't do. And I think that's like really the power of arts and culture in this moment for these projects, to really help people like kind of visualize what is possible with these spaces. And I don't want to lose sight of that, because I think it's so important. And there's a bunch of other stuff I wanted to kind of dig into with you, but I'm just going to let you keep talking. But just
no, I think that's really, I love that, because like I look at sections of the corridor that we've developed now, right, that see 20,000 visitors a day, right? And I look at photos of when the art program began, and I'm like, man, we had a bunch of Burning Man weirdos out here and set a whole bunch of stuff on fire. We would never be able to do that now. But the excitement in these like phases of activation is what brought people together, right? It was, communities who have been making art in this space for decades. And that, I think, is something that we have to keep at the front of our praxis, right? Is moving towards place keeping versus place making, right? And that mandate to keep place is to realize that arts and culture already exists in this ecosystem. And by leveraging your infrastructure to elevate what's already there, you get something wholly iconic and unique to your city, right? Atlanta is never going to be New York. Atlanta doesn't need to be Philadelphia or Austin or LA. Atlanta needs to be Atlanta, pit bulls and all. Like just what that's us, right? And so that has to remain at the forefront of when we're thinking of activating these spaces and the evolution of activating these spaces, which is why art was always first. It was in the vanguard of all the work that we've done at the Beltline. A new interim trail coming through, no concrete, but we've cleared the kudzu. Big art's going out there because we want people to go out there and walk around. And we want those artists to be from those neighborhoods we're moving through.
Absolutely.
I love what you're both saying too, because, we started this conversation by acknowledging the fact this rails to trails thing. Everyone knows the rail. Oh my God, I just lost the name. What's the thing in New York called?
The High Line.
The High Line, right. Everyone knows the High Line. And I think when, these projects happen in cities like Philadelphia and Miranda, potentially you can tell us more about Atlanta, there's a fear that along with this sort of improvement or this sort of increased access to public space or this beautification or whatever you want to call it comes gentrification, or comes the idea that you'll be pushed out of your neighborhood. And it's so unfortunate that, we live in a country where any improvements to your neighborhood might signify to a long-term resident that means that they're maybe being invited to leave, which is really devastating. But is art sort of part of the answer to help pull in the community, to help them understand? To Miranda, your point, nothing's going to be the High Line, right? That was in Manhattan. Nothing's going to be like that. What we're talking about is transforming these old infrastructures, these industrial area infrastructures, into something more useful for communities, right? And then maybe along with that, some policy to make sure long-term residents are protected. But I don't know, what do you think about that?
Can we just say for a moment that Miranda's dealing with a whole lot more than the High Line? So it's a really interesting question, because we tend to think the High Line is the largest park, but the Beltline is massive. Like, how many more times bigger is it than the High Line, Miranda?
It's a lot. But it's also a different kind of project, right? Whereas the High Line is a park, the rail line is a park. The Atlanta Beltline is not a park. We are a transit corridor. And so the entire intention was to reconnect these disconnected neighborhoods that were devastated by extremely racist infrastructure projects that were responsive to the civil rights movement in this city. We have 4 major highways that divided up this neighborhood, that divided up the city, decimated Black immigrant and working class neighborhoods, like literally obliterated them off the map and made access to jobs and education out of reach for tons of people. And so we see the effects of gentrification have been happening as a slow moving train, no pun intended, in this city for a very long time. And it has come in waves. You know, the first wave was, you know, in the 70s, and then second wave was around the Olympics in the 90s. And then with the Beltline is a third wave. You know, the Beltline gets treated like beachfront property. And so when the project began, nobody had any idea that developers would be like, oh my gosh, and just jump on it, and it would become unaffordable to live around the corridor and displace legacy residents. And so now our sister organization and even our own economic development team and our community engagement team have developed incredibly robust programs to fund, you know, local small businesses, DBEs, which are disadvantaged business enterprises, to even the legacy retention program for legacy residents, you know, which is an entire trust fund meant to help keep people in their homes. We were just going to build a trail was the original vision. And now it's become a lot of wraparound services too. And so, and those wraparound services become a community obligation of any infrastructure project. So if your infrastructure project is not considering those wraparound services, that's a red flag.
And I just want to tie together a few things there too, because I feel like we kind of toss around the term gentrification, but it means so many different things to different people. And there are definitely, in a former life, I can think of you know, neighborhoods I worked in where long-term residents wanted to sell and wanted to move away, and that's perfectly fine. But I think when we start framing it in terms of displacement and we start getting into the specificity, as you're mentioning, of economic displacement, of physical displacement, of cultural displacement, then we can come up with these strategies to kind of address each one of those. And I think that's so important for these projects to be taking on. So, yeah, thank you for sharing. And I just.
It is. And I think like you can't put shine on everything. You have to be very real and authentic in your approach to what your project does. And artists have long been considered, you know, the first wave gentrifiers when we talk about displacement, right? Because most of us are broke and we're looking for places to live, but then a place becomes hip and cool, and then developers come, and it's like this very predatory and extractive cycle, right? And so it becomes the responsibility of the project to say, how do I change this? What policies do I put in place? And so one of the things we do a ton of sub-area master planning. There's arts and culture strategic implementation plans. There's city policies. There's tons of bureaucratic layers to help protect people. And sometimes they're not all perfect. So you can do as much as you can do, but that's why a partnership with the private sector is incredibly important, because you have to get the city and developers to buy in to how important it is to keep people in place if they want to stay, right? Mm-hmm. Because the reason that people come to Atlanta is not, you know, to see a whole bunch of tech bros like, you know, on scooters. Like, that's not why people come to Atlanta. You know, no shade to them. They're very cool. Thank you for your money and patronizing all of our local businesses. But, you know, it's the music, it's the culture, it's the people who've been here, who created the Black Mecca that is Atlanta. And if all of those cultural makers that made Atlanta so beautiful and magical and powerful, that changed this country, you know, can't live here, it's not Atlanta anymore.
I mean, but it feels so weighty, because I think to myself, like, I remember maybe like 6 or 7 years ago, there was a article that I had read in the Atlantic, and just the headline, it was saying that the Beltline might erase some racial divisions, right? And it talked about you guys going through 45 different neighborhoods. And I can only think to myself, like, people are looking for you to change systemic things. And I wonder, like, what does that mean for our rail park? You know, it's, when I think about the rail park going through certain neighborhoods, I am excited about the opportunity to connect them as well, right? And I also think to myself, that we are so spaced out in Philadelphia, even though we feel like we're so connected, or, our neighborhoods are so, pushed apart as well. I want everybody to feel like they own the rail park, the way that they talk about the Beltline. But I also understand that it's more than what, your job is to do. It's a community driven effort. So I guess I'm wondering, like, what are we saying when we say something so huge? I know, I don't even know where to begin.
I don't know, Ginger.
I know, Ginger, when you're saying that too, I'm thinking, you talked about the power of public space. I mean, what you're talking about is the power of our public space, the power to bring us together. I mean, think about every civilization from as far back as we can look. Our public space has been the center of our communities and the center of change and the center of togetherness and the center of protest and the center of everything. So that's what you're talking about, Ginger. And yes, I'm right there. And the rail park.
I think you have to adopt, like, when you're in a position like Rebecca or myself or Cecilia at the Highline, or, anybody, you have to almost adopt like the Spider-Man mantra, like with, great power comes great responsibility. And you can't be a gatekeeper, you have to be a gate holder, right? You gotta like sit there and jam your foot in the door and hold it open as long and as hard as you can until you get reinforcements to help you hold that gate open. And because it does feel like a lot, it feels overwhelming, and you end up either being overexposed as a single human, right? Where you're just like, my DMs are open, like send me a message, let's go have coffee, let's, talk about how you're feeling, right? Or you retreat into the bureaucracy. And so I think like it's a balance that people in the position of Rebecca or myself have to really strike, is saying like, yeah, this is a lot of responsibility. This is heavy. I can't do it alone. I need community to do it with me. Come help me hold this gate open, right? And that's, for me, that has been very helpful because my DMs tend to explode quite a bit.
I think about that a lot, like before we were so much more, than we are now at the rail park. Well, that's not what I meant to say. Like before we had this section of the rail park that was open, this phase 1, you were here in Philadelphia talking about trying to do that placekeeping. And I just remember being so impassioned by what you were saying, because it just felt like you were holding your city down, like, and that sort of galvanized me to want to see what I could do for the rail park. And I think that it's that kind of passion that a lot of people feel for the rail park here. Like we had the tire swing fund. Like I felt like that was a really lovely thing. Like we thought about something that people have been doing creatively on the rail park before you were really supposed to be up there. But I felt like calling it that just meant like, keep dreaming, keep being creative, keep knowing that we're here with the community members, and in being inspired to say like, this is what we want you to do, or we're going to keep the spirit of that alive on the rail park. And I think people, they need that to stay along with us for the ride.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just put in a quick plug for an ongoing program that we have, actually, or initiative rather, through Friends of the Rail Park, which is the Rail Park Time Capsules. The idea is that we are creating a digital cultural asset map looking at all 10 neighborhoods that the Rail Park is a part of. And we're just inviting people to share a memory or something that they love about their neighborhood. And then on the back end, kind of translating how that's going to go into, planning of future phases. But what I like about it is, rather than, we've all been to these charrettes where everyone wants to know like what you want to change about your neighborhood or what you don't like, or like, the trash doesn't get picked up, blah, blah, blah. This is very asset based, and it's asking, what do we want to celebrate, and how do you want, public space and your neighborhood to look and feel, 5-10 years from now? What is that dream that you have? And so that's just like a short term and like a very, superficial, but still like we're inviting kind of this input at this early stage into the process. So I would just put in a plug for that. But yeah, I agree. It's there's a big undertaking for us. And I think for me, at least, thinking about, where Friends of the Rail Park is as an organization, it's also like how to build the entity that enables people to participate in the capacity that they feel empowered and, able to do so. And so that's also just like a tricky kind of organizational, planning and building kind of thing that we have to go through too. So
it totally is. Whew. That's a huge part, like inviting people along for the ride. And Ginger, I want to touch on something you said. I don't hold this city down by myself. You know, I am a white lady who has access because of my formal education in the arts and the internship I got at the Beltline, and then the curatorial position I got, that benefits grossly from the privilege of my skin tone that got me in this position, that allows me to walk around and have amazing meetings like this with a lot of people. There is an incredible, incredible group of humans in this city that are doing such amazing accountability work and curatorial work and art theoretical work around our public shared spaces, that it is breathtaking. And I am honored that I get to kind of stand on their shoulders or be held and supported by them. And so it's definitely a teamwork makes the dream work kind of thing. And I happen to be relatively good at running my mouth, so I get to come and talk to y'all about stuff like this. But Atlanta has always been a small, big city, right? And the arts community, particularly the curatorial and administrative community, is very tight knit. And we all hold each other down, you know, and we all keep each other accountable. And so if I'm out of line, it is not 5 minutes past me stepping out of line that someone's calling me and is like, hey, we need to go have a talk. So, and, you know, and that makes me better. And so that's something I think that in this position, you know, I wouldn't be where I am if it wasn't for that community.
I appreciate you saying that. I think not a lot of people want to share that kind of spotlight. I think you being willing to even say that shows why you're such a change maker. You just don't see that honesty much. I think Conrad and I appreciate that because that's how we feel when we bring people on. Like, you're only as strong as the next person, right? We keep learning and sharing with one another.
Right.
Do you think
It's an
too,
ecosystem.
I was going to say, so we have a couple of questions coming in too. So feel free to continue typing them either in the Q&A box or the chat, and we can sort of dance around a few of them until the end of our conversation. And again, the last 10 minutes, if you want to turn your camera on, we can do that too. But we have a really interesting question here from Zerby, who I think this might underscore, again, some of the skepticism that a lot of folks who live around these places when these ideas are proposed, like, often have. So I don't know if either of you would have a direct answer to this question in particular, or if you can just reflect on maybe sort of what space it holds. But Zerby is asking, do you feel that a lot of times areas are purposefully neglected to decrease value in neighborhoods in order to devalue properties so that investors can eventually buy up property and gentrify neighborhoods, again, using that term? But I think that's an example, again, of some of the skepticism some folks feel when, and maybe it's the same in Atlanta, you know, there's been neighborhoods in Philly that have been so don't get the same services and, let's say, Center City does. And so when projects like this come, there's real skepticism. Like, you know, how do you deal with that?
I mean, that's the definition of redlining, to devalue a neighborhood. And then
oh, there you go.
Yeah. So I was looking over that question like, oh boy, do we have enough time for this one? But yeah, let's get into it.
But sorry, I jumped on that. Go ahead, Brent.
The short answer,
No,
yeah.
that's what, no, Rebecca, you were right there. We're like, yeah. So in Atlanta, the evidence of redlining is out there and it's very loud. Like, you could go down one street and it's boulevard and boulevard. You cross over Ponce and it turns into Monroe, because that's where the white folks lived. And there used to be a wall there that separated the old Fourth Ward from moving into, you know, the next neighborhood over. And so that is one of the things that the Beltline intentionally combats. There's now laws in Atlanta that doesn't allow for like slumlord negligence and that sort of like property denigration and disinvestment to the point of collapse. Like, there are serious penalties and laws against that now, because they learned their lesson, both from what happened directly as a result of the redlining laws that came out of Jim Crow and after World War II, and then the response to the civil rights movement and the integration of banks and schools and on and on. But then also the Olympics came through. And so we saw a huge like surge of investment and then disinvestment, like neighborhoods that were promised the sun and the moon and the stars. And then after the Olympics left, they were left to collapse. So as a result, from all these different waves of construction, infrastructure building, and subsequent investment and disinvestment, when the Beltline was coming online, that was something that was intentionally looked at in a lot of our overlay planning, was to prevent slumlords from happening.
Miranda, you've mentioned the Olympics a few times. Is this like a constant conversation with folks there? Like it came, it went, it did bad things, or, you know, ultimate.
Absolutely. It's like, if you live in an Olympic city, particularly one that didn't necessarily have the infrastructure for Olympics ahead of time, there are spaces in your city that feel like ghost towns or like relics, like a thing that was built and then abandoned. And Atlanta's done a pretty good job at reusing a lot of the infrastructure that was used for the sporting events and things like that. But then there's still like neighborhoods and apartments and condos and things like that that were built that you're just like, why is that there? It's falling into that kudzu ravine. And so it is like, the Olympics was kind of a big turning point for the city as far as like coming online as a serious metro and being considered, you know, a mover and shaker in, you know, in the whole like cityscape of the universe. Plus Outkast came out with a really important album, you know, a couple of years later, and everyone learned that the South had something to say.
And Rebecca, it looked like you had something, a response to Zerby's question too. Is that right?
I mean, I think Miranda kind of touched on similar themes that I was going to respond to, but I would also just add that we know that the rail park has already increased property values within I think it's the 10-minute walk shed of the park by between 16 and 22%, and that is projected across the full 3-mile, you know, vision for the park as well. And that's a lot of money to be made, you know, potentially for the city, for developers, et cetera. And so I think that's another part of the, you know, the work that we're trying to do is to understand how can we build pathways for residents who live in the neighborhoods that the rail park touches to not only access the benefits of public space and, you know, be able to physically, you know, enjoy the park, but also access the benefits of that investment. And that's a whole other, you know, creative spark conversation to be had about equitable development and planning for that, and, you know, the partnerships that need to, you know, be in place to get that work done. But that's definitely something that we're thinking about. So I'll stop talking and we can take another question.
Yeah,
You know, I think, sorry, Ginger, one of the things that I wanted us to touch on, and I don't think we've talked a whole lot about, is really like how artists access these platforms, right? And what that sort of infrastructure looks like. If an artist is like, cool, I'm gonna be in Atlanta, I want to do a mural, or like, I'm going to be in Philly, I want to throw a sculpture up, you know, like, what do I do? A lot of times with these like pseudo city or city projects, there's an open call for artists to participate, and it'll be an RFP or an RFQ, which in, you know, abbreviation language is like a call for proposals or for your qualifications. And typically those are posted online or on social media and things like that. And that's how they participate. I wish I could just allow any artist on the planet to come and like do cool stuff in our view shed, but I can't, right? And so I have to be protective of our corridor and our view shed. So we have this pretty like strict process for how to get pieces on the corridor. But then once you're there, you have like the full support of this massive infrastructure project. You want to go talk to a transit engineer? I've got you. Like if you want to go talk to a landscape architect, cool, I got you. You can talk to all these people. So I think that is, you know, something I want to make sure we touch on, you know, is that we're not just talking about the infrastructure, but how artists can participate in that infrastructure. And it is typically through these big processes. And if you don't know how to access that, we at the Beltline, we do tons of workshops, like how to do a proposal, how to respond to an RFQ, how to get Miranda's attention on Instagram. Like we do a lot of this stuff, you know, and to make sure that people feel like they can participate, right? Because applying to a project can feel overwhelming. So we want to make sure that there's something very humanizing and accessible about it.
that's true. I was just going to say, sometimes I hate to sort of like imagine that everybody understands what we're talking about. So if someone doesn't understand these sort of restrictive real estate covenants that we're talking about and redlining, there's a wonderful PBS documentary out right now, and it's called Redlining, the Laws of Jim Crow North, and they sort of touch on the South as well. I think it's running for free on PBS. So if you want to catch up on that, it explains it very easily. But it's something that I think a lot of people need to understand that is just so embedded into our early 20th century.
Well, and Ginger, we've only planned the next couple of months. So if our brand new The Spark the Creative Spark listeners want us to host an episode about that, we can certainly do that. So please email us or comment, let us know. We are the 10-minute mark, so if you have more questions, let us know, but we have a few in the chat. If you want to come on camera, let us know too. I know some people want to face the guest, but this is a really great question that fits into the art conversation we're just having, which is, how do you pick the artists that you pick? Miranda, you mentioned too, and I think Rebecca, you probably have a similar thing going on at the Rail Park. You have permanent projects and temporary projects. The temporary projects allow you a lot more freedom and experimentation, where I'm sure the permanent artworks require a much longer process or much more input. So talk to us through that. How are you picking the art and the artists that you're picking for these spaces? And we'll start with Miranda.
So we have a couple of different processes. Like if you have a fully formed exhibition and you're like, I want to do this amazing photographic exhibition on the Beltline, and it's a fully formed idea, you just submit a PDF to me. It runs through the Beltline Public Arts Advisory Council for vetting, and then we work on a date, if they approve it, of when to get it produced. If you're seeking funding and you have
I cut you off right as you were going to answer my question. I was like, again, what if they have an idea but no money? Okay.
Right. If you have a great idea and no money, you apply to the annual Art on the Atlanta Beltline exhibition. And you basically say, like, here are my credentials. I've only ever done watercolor, but my best friend is a great muralist. So we're going to team up. We want to do a mural. And you will submit your credentials. In years past, we had an RFP where you had to come with a fully formed idea. But after doing a lot of listening sessions with community, that's asking a lot of labor from people who maybe are not necessarily equipped to produce at that level. So we've moved to an RFQ for this upcoming season. So really revolutionary. After 12 years of doing this, we're finally moving to an RFQ. So now you'll submit a cover letter, your artist bio, and a link to either a virtual portfolio or your website. And that's it. And then a jury will review and score all of these submittals, and then the highest ones will get shortlisted with like what we can fit inside our budget, and then we'll move on from there with a second round of jurying till we'll produce everything within the budget I've been allotted. And those go into production usually in the fall, and they're on exhibit for a year. And then the ones that people fall in love with, sometimes we keep, sometimes we'll extend their commission, and sometimes we'll acquisition those pieces.
So what does it seem like for us, Rebecca? Because I know people are going to be listening to Miranda like, well, why aren't we?
So I would say for the permanent exhibitions that are on phase 1 of the Rail Park, so the finished, already constructed part, most of that was done or commissioned through the Percent for Public Art program through the city of Philadelphia. So there's a whole, kind of vetting and selection process that kind of goes with, being an artist who participates in that program that we don't have a lot of say over. We're also not actively, building anything at the moment. So it's kind of a moot point, but a very neat program for Philadelphia to have nonetheless. We are definitely much more in the kind of temporary installation space. We work with a lot of, I consider performers to be artists as well. So, thinking about, activation of the Rail Park. For that, we have also run an RFQ process in the past. For example, we were trying to work with a bunch of illustrators last year, so we kind of ran that process. Our kind of selection and vetting at the moment is largely run through our community engagement and partnerships committee, which we are also, I'll just put in a plug in for that, actively recruiting for right now. So get in touch if you are interested in joining a committee at the Rail Park. But a lot of it comes down to funding for us, right? And, kind of our limited staff capacity. So a lot of the work that we do has to happen in partnership with organizations that have capacity and expertise. So for example, we partner quite frequently with Asian Arts Initiative and Philadelphia Chinatown Development Corporation to bring temporary public art installations, temporary cultural installations to either the Rail Park or kind of the interstitial spaces between Chinatown and the Rail Park as well. So that's kind of one example, but I think we're open to collaborations going forward. Funding is always an issue for us, but we're also willing to, if you have a really great idea, like willing to entertain that and partner on joint grant applications, that kind of thing. Especially thinking about phase 1 or activation of other future phases of the park as well.
We have another question in QA, and this one is for you too, Rebecca. They just want to know if that feasibility study will be available to the public when completed.
So we're planning on probably not like the full thing, but kind of the executive summary, making that available to the public. We'll also be talking about it at great length, so consider this the preview for much more to come. It's really an exciting time for the park and for, you know, I think Philadelphia as a whole. So yes, coming soon.
We should also acknowledge someone put one of our the Creative Spark listeners put a resource for learning about redlining in the chat that everyone can see. So feel free to click on that. And again, if you're interested in seeing that, Ginger and I can schedule one of our months to be a talk about that for sure. I would love to sort of wrap this up with maybe it's a really simple question, but I think it could go to the heart of why this work is so important. And that's just, you know, why is the public space important for you personally? And then why do you think it's important for your neighborhoods and your cities? Miranda, I see you.
I have so many feelings about this.
You promised us some like rebelliousness tonight. We need some.
I know. Okay. So one of the things that I most ethically struggle with is it possible to cite public art on stolen land? And so we're all on stolen land. These projects are happening on stolen land. And so when I think about the commissioning and the process of putting public art out, who is at the table making that decision? Who has a say so in that? Because public art is supposed to express like the best of us, like our hopes and dreams, what we want to be as a society and as a community, right? And if people who have been historically displaced, and in Atlanta, that's not that long ago, right? Like when either we're talking about gentrification, right, and we're redlining back to the Civil War, or we're talking about the displacement of the Cherokee and Muskogee people, you know, as recently as, you know, 1831, which is not that long ago. I mean, Atlanta was a hit crossroads at that point. And so when we talk about public space and our shared space, who is at the table making those decisions? And for me, a lot of that means like I have to, in my practice, I have to center people who I don't see necessarily making public art all the time. You can't do a land acknowledgement or say land back, right, without doing some sort of work towards that, right? Then it's just empty. So in my little subversive practice, like some of that is like, how do I get people who have been marginalized or these spaces have been made inaccessible to them or told it wasn't for them? How do we make these spaces about and curated by those folks?
I don't have anything nearly as deep as what you just shared, Miranda. But I'll just say for me, I always think about art as an expression of culture and culture as an expression of community. And I think that happens best in public space where it's free and accessible to most people, or kind of the majority of people living in these areas. And so I think that's what kind of pulls me to public space, to thinking about projects like the Rail Park, like the Beltline, and just, I think, making the most of these existing assets and you know, the cities that we're a part of. So I'll stop there.
Absolutely.
I feel like that gives us a lot to chew on. I
My
noticed
DMs are always open. Like
it's very quiet in the chat, very quiet in the Q&A, and I hope it's because, you know, they're thinking about more questions to come and wanting to be involved in these projects now.
Yeah, please be involved. And I'm curious too, before this call, Rebecca, had you ever been to Atlanta Beltline? And Miranda, had you ever been to the Rail Park?
Yes, I've been to the Rail Park many times in all of its iterations. And so I'm in love with Philadelphia. And so like any excuse I have to get up to Philly and stroll around the Rail Park, I absolutely take.
Come back and visit us soon. And I've also been to the Beltline, but a long time ago when you're just getting started with like physical development. So I can't wait to get back and see how it's grown.
Let's kudzu now.
I I guess that's how we're ending it. Well, everyone Google that word. I've never heard of it. Sounds terrifying. But yeah, Rebecca, Miranda, thank you so much for your time. This has been such a great conversation. Thanks for everyone who tuned in live. We really appreciate the live guests. This recording will be available. But thanks for everyone who tuned in live, and we'll be back in what, Ginger, 1 month with our next month. Should we say the theme? Should we tease it?
Go for it. Go for it.
Yeah, we'll save it. Follow us on social media.
Wow, he's gonna save it. But everybody who joined us tonight, we tried to send out an email full of resources so that you can take some time and go over information that we weren't able to tonight. So look out for that. But yeah, guys, I wish we had more time. Oh, and please, thank you to our sponsor, Ray Reid, for helping us make these episodes possible. We really do appreciate being able to have this hour to chat about different things.
I'm so bad at the sponsor reads. Yes, thank you for.
I want to say that Ray Reid makes it possible for us to talk to all of these change makers. So thank you again.
Awesome. Well, thanks, y'all. Until next time.
Bye, guys.